Hello, everyone. Welcome to the very first public event of the R. Rebecca Donatelli Expert in Residence in Political Analysis and Media program. It's the only time I'm going to say that today, but I didn't blow it. So this is a brand new program, and it was established by online pioneer and USC Trojan alum and an Annenberg parent. So double applause, Becky Donatelli. We hope that it is going to open up new conversations at USC about the future of political communication and the roles our students can play in designing that future. And again, a very special thank you to you, Becky. We're thrilled that you're here with us today. So in order to launch this series, we reached for the stars. We did. And we nabbed one in Cokie Roberts, political commentator for ABC News and a contributing senior analyst to National Public Radio. You know, Cokie, as you all know, is one of the most highly regarded journalists in the industry. She has a career that spans television, radio, newspapers, and books. She is a cross-platform journalist before we even use that term. Right, Cokie? It struck me that for many of us, Cokie is absolutely inseparable from television and radio news coverage, and particularly political news coverage. But we also realize that many of you, our students, don't know her personal or professional history as well as the rest of us do. Cokie is the daughter of two prominent U.S. representatives, Hale and Lindy Boggs, who represented a district in New Orleans for some 50 years. And she grew up in New Orleans, but also on Capitol Hill. That was a bit of her playground. And she went on to build a career and a life there as a nationally recognized congressional reporter, an analyst, and co-anchor of one of the best-known Sunday morning political news shows this week. We thought, Cokie, as I mentioned earlier, that it might be fun for our students to see a little bit of your storied past. Just to embarrass Cokie, I went into the archives, deep into the archives. And I am going to play, if at all.
I'm Sam Donaldson. Her full name is Mary Martha Corrine Morrison Claiborne Boggs Roberts, but I call her the Cokester.
She arrived in Washington as the daughter of Louisiana Representative Hale Boggs and split her time growing up between the nation's capital and New Orleans. With politics so much a part of her life, it only seemed right that when Cokie married Steve Roberts in her family's backyard in Bethesda, President Lyndon Johnson was one of the guests. Her mother personally cooked the entire wedding feast.
For weeks before this wedding, you'd come into the kitchen and the ovens would have big signs on them saying, "I'm a turkey, take me out at 6.
Always a high achiever, Cokie started out as an anchor at the tender age of 21 for the Washington NBC affiliate, a show called Meeting of the Minds. She then followed Steve, a New York Times reporter, to Manhattan and became a reporter-editor at a small business newsletter.
It was essentially reporting and then writing very brief little stories, and I loved it.
Then it was a move to Los Angeles, where Cokie juggled motherhood and a job producing the educational show It's Academic. Suddenly, tragedy struck. Her father, now House Majority Leader, had disappeared in a small plane over Alaska. The plane was never recovered. Cokie's mother took over his House seat. Shortly thereafter, the New York Times dispatched Steve to Greece. Just as the Roberts arrived, chaos broke out in Cyprus, giving Cokie her first big break. It was 1974. The Greek military dictatorship staged a coup d'etat, and the Turks sent in troops.
When the Turks invaded, CBS called me and said, file a spot. And I had never written a radio spot in my life, and nobody had ever told me how to write a radio spot.
I'm driving down the street in Washington, and over the radio comes the unmistakable voice of my child. So at least I knew she was all right.
Soon after the Greek dictatorship fell, and Cokie's story led the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite that night. Then it was back to D.C. for Steve's job, so Cokie once again was pounding the pavement. Steve stumbled on the recently created National Public Radio.
Instinctively, I said, that's the perfect place for my wife to work.
I still have this vivid memory of Steve walking in through our glass doors at our old address and handing me this resume of this woman that I didn't know at all, Cokie Roberts.
That would represent one of the last moments that someone in the industry didn't know who Cokie Roberts was. From 1981 to 1984, in addition to her NPR duties, she co-hosted The Lawmakers, a weekly public television program on Congress. Then the McNeil-Lehrer News Hour, before she joined ABC News. There, she became a contributor on This Week with David Brinkley. Talk about shaking things up.
What is your definition of womanizing?
Most women know it when they see it, Senator. Well, I think that some people are born kooks, actually, but yeah, I do.
You want to go to gene theory, really? And oh, that Cokie laugh.
Well, it's time to go.
From there, covering conventions, guest anchoring Nightline, to sitting at the helm of This Week. She's also written 2 bestsellers that have an important theme to understanding Cokie. Her family comes first. She'll always be first in my book. Congratulations, Cokie.
That was Cokie's co-anchor from 1996 to 2002 on This Week, Sam Donaldson. And they had a chemistry that was rather unique, rather distinct. You know, it was the era before the shouting of cable news, really, and certainly before face-offs on social media, Twitter and Facebook, as we see today. Cokie offered a razor-sharp take combined with that very cool, dry wit, and it made for quite a contrast with Sam's, well, more blustery, almost physically explosive style. Cokie, as you see, never needed to shout to get her points across.
That's This Week for Sunday, November 24th, 1996.
Welcome. As David Brinkley likes to say, we're all here and ready to go.
All here on our new set, new program, but a lot of familiar faces. Sam's
That's right. I mean,
especially.
it looks new, but folks, it's kind of old in a way, too.
And as always, we will bring you the news every Sunday morning.
Well, that's our program for this week. We hope you've enjoyed it and thought it was worth coming back next week. And may I say to the Cokester, it's been a real pleasure.
The Cokester. He calls me the Cokester.
You should hear her full name. We don't have time for it.
But it was fun, Sam, and it'll be fun next week when we hope you'll be with us. And
Bye.
watch World News Tonight. Bye. Welcome back. It's Thanksgiving's over, and now it's December, Sam.
Ah, December, yes. I love this month like everyone else. I'm going to spend more money than I have, but I have credit cards. I'm going to eat more than I should. I can cinch up my belt, let it out one more. I don't know. All the surveys say December is the most stressful month, and I agree.
I don't know why it should be stressful for men. This is a month where women do all the cooking and all the shopping, but hey, go ahead and be stressed if you want to.
Okay. And finally, more heartache for former presidential advisor Dick Morris, embroiled in a sex scandal from last summer. His wife, Eileen McGann, has left him and is telling friends she wants a divorce. And that's the news. And I take it, Cokie, from what you've said recently, you're not surprised by Eileen McGann's move.
I'm surprised it took her this long. I am surprised at that. With the State of the Union coming up this week, it'll be interesting to see if this bipartisan mood will hold, particularly with all of the conversation about campaign finances and the partisanship that's likely to erupt over that.
Oh, yeah, the campaign money. The day this week, the president used the phrase, mistakes were made. Now, that comes from the Nixon administration. It's a phrase which usually means somebody did it, but not me.
I think it's engraved on the presidential lectern because they all seem to say it. We were taught by the nuns to never use the passive voice, but apparently presidents do.
Yeah, right. Well, there's no major news this morning, Cokie, except I guess we should say that the groundhog in Pennsylvania, Puxatawny Phil, did not see his shadow this morning. That means, apparently, that we're going to have an early spring.
I wish the groundhogs were accurate more often.
Oh, well, there's that, but it's something to watch.
I mean, if he doesn't agree to testify, can he ever be forced to talk?
Well, the president hasn't refused yet to testify, at least not formally on the record.
Boy, I'm reaching the point where it sounds like that to me.
Well, there have been the overtures from the independent counsel's office, and they've been rebuffed, but the independent counsel hasn't come forward. president would eventually have to testify, it seems to me, and yet at the White House they're certainly setting it up for him to say, Ken Starr is an out-of-control, right-wing Richard Mellon-Scaife puppet, and I'm
the
not
White
coming.
House is lucky in its enemies. I mean, Ken Starr has a 17% approval rating. It is hard to get that low. Only Newt Gingrich competes with him, and those are the two main attackers.
If substantial evidence is committed that Mr. Clinton has perjured himself, I cannot believe that
He can't
Americans
do
would
it.
say
If the
it's
Dow
okay.
Jones goes to 10,000 or 11,000.
Look at the press conference. Look back at the press conference. He couldn't answer the questions.
And what's he going to say?
Well, we'll see if the president can get out from this. He sure has gotten out from everything else. We'll be back with more in a minute. I would like to get to this question, though, of Al Gore and separating himself. He doesn't seem to do that. He has spent a week of an announcement a day, and some of them have been quite remarkable. He was on CNN's Late Edition, where he took credit for the internet. Let's look at Al Gore.
During my service in the United States Congress, I took the initiative in creating the internet.
There you go. He did it all by himself.
Listen to George Willie. Sounds like you're almost saying that the Supreme Court took this case at a time when it felt, forgive me, it might have to save George W. Bush's bacon. But now, if it doesn't have to do that... Oh, excuse me, Justices. As George has told you, for Cokie and me, this is our last broadcast as the co-anchors of this program. I want to say it's been a great honor and pleasure to have been part of this program for 21 years. Thanks to Roone Arledge, the top television producer of all time, who allowed me to work with the incomparable David Brinkley, and then as co-anchor with Cokie, as the very best in our business and the very best friend anyone could ever hope to have. These Sunday shows are among the last bastion of regular serious discussion of serious issues on the networks, and that's lamentable. But for those of us who've had the privilege of showing up here on Sunday mornings, it's been very rewarding, and I shall miss it.
Well, Sam, 15 years ago when I first sat down in this studio with you and George and David Brinkley, you were looking for a skirt, as you recall. I never expected that I would still be here today. And it's been 15 fascinating years. We've been interesting places, interviewed fascinating people, seen a lot of history. But the most rewarding part has been the people we've worked with, the staff of the program, the crew here in the studio around us, the control room, the makeup room, but most of all working with you, Sam. I'm not going to miss the 5 a.m. alarm, and you and I will work together on other things, but I will miss being with you on Sunday morning.
Louis, this is the continuation of a beautiful friendship.
George Stephanopoulos will be in this spot next week, and we wish him all the best.
You bet.
And until next week, that's this week.
Career in broadcasting, Cokie's won countless awards. A couple of Emmys, and Edward R. Murrow, just to name a few. All of her books, and she's written on quite a range of topics, from great women in American history to women's roles in relationships, marriage, her own and others, and very appropriate for this time of year, a book on interfaith family traditions. They've all been bestsellers. And with her husband, Stephen Roberts, still writes a weekly column. Cokie was named one of the 50 greatest women in the history of broadcasting and a living legend by the Library of Congress, and we couldn't agree more. But I'd like to add, she's just one of the great women, period. So without further introduction and no more clips, let's welcome Cokie Roberts. There will be payback, I'm sure.
Thank you. I must say, looking at particularly the end right there, I packed yesterday saying, bring a long skirt. Those skirts were way too short. But really, it is a treat to be here. Becky, thank you for having this visiting expert or whatever I'm supposed to be. But having the students here meet with people coming in from the past, and Willow, what a nice friendship we've had for so many years, and it's a treat to see you in this new academic role and doing wonderfully here, and I have so many friends here. Jeff Cowan and I go back to college together, and he briefly dated a good friend of mine, and we and Judy Muller and I have worked together in various places around the globe. So you folks are very, very lucky in the faculty that you have here and the wonderful people who are here. I was told always a mistake, that I could talk about anything I wanted. And when I am writing something fresh, like a speech or an article or a book, I tend not to write about what I do every day, all day. So I'm not going to talk about the 2016 election or the upcoming papal visit, which I'll be covering like a cheap suit. But I'd be happy to take questions about either of those. But I actually decided that because I am in a school of journalism, that I would talk about women in journalism. Because it is, first of all, our journalism schools, I see a nice smattering of young men here. That's unusual, and I'm delighted because the pay scale keeps going down as more women keep entering the field. But the fact is true. The fact is, our journalism schools around the country are about 2/3 female, and so I wanted to tell you a little bit about your foremothers and what they did coming before you to make smooth your path, but also to make the world of American society and American journalism a more complete place. You know, when I write these great big history books about women, people say to me, "Why do you write about women?" It seems fairly obvious to me, you know, why I write about women, but I do also feel that you know, the other half of the human race actually counts. And actually, you saw up there the children's book of founding mothers about the women in the founding period. And a children's book came out last year on it with fabulous illustrations by the incredible Diane Good. And so I went around talking to kids about it, and I would say to them, you know, all those pictures of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, you know, is anything missing? And the little boys would always say something completely just outlandish and weird, you know, that symbol, what symbol, you know, but they'd make up something that worked for them. But the little girls would finally one of them would raise her hand and say, "Women, there are no women in the pictures." And I'd say, "Right, well, do you think there were women then?" And they'd get all giggly, you know, because then they'd say, "Yeah, there were women then." And I'd say, "How do you know?" Well, that leads to sex, frankly. And so then, and so that was tough on them at age 8. But they would then say, "Well, you know, they couldn't be men without women." Bingo. But so I do think that this history does matter. So this is just an alert. I am about to give you a history lesson going back to colonial times, when 16 of the 78 papers in the country were edited by women. We have never come near that percentage, anywhere close to that percentage again. But at that point, to be a journalist, all you needed was a printing press. And I mean, I can never get over the fact that the founders wrote the First Amendment, because, you know, you think we're bad, meet the press of the late 18th, early 19th century, where they were just kind of making it up. But the women in that period before the Revolution were highly influential, and one of them really is someone whose name should be in your brains, and that is Mary Catherine Goddard. She was the publisher in 1762 of the Providence Gazette and Country Journal. Her mother had staked her and her brother to the money for the paper. Her brother was a rabble-rousing no-show, and he would run off to various places. And finally, they set up shop in Baltimore, where her name was the name on the masthead of the Maryland Gazette and Baltimore Advertiser. And after the Declaration of Independence was promulgated, the signers had never actually printed it with their names on it, because they were marked men. They were you know, treasonous to the king. And so they had to escape Philadelphia. The British were coming. And they ended up in Baltimore, and by then they were ready to have the Declaration printed with their names. They went to the preeminent person, printer, newspaper in Baltimore, to Mary Catherine Goddard. And she printed the Declaration, but she also, because it was what printers did at the time, but she did it with tremendous courage, printers printed their own names, kind of like a union bug, on documents. So her name is there. Along the side. The men's names are here, her name's there. That document's in the Library of Congress. But that made her a signer of sorts and made her someone who was marked by the crown. So it was an incredibly courageous thing for her to do. She also was a postmistress, and has happened so many times since. She was later displaced from both of her jobs. Her brother showed up and took over the paper. And after the United States became a country, she was told that no women could be postmistresses anymore. So she then had the men of Baltimore, 200 businessmen in Baltimore, petitioned to get her back the job. That document is in the National Archives, but it didn't work, and she ended up in bookbindery and bookselling until the end of her life. But those kinds of appeals of people coming to Washington to petition the government for various things did bring women to Washington over the centuries. And they came for various reasons. One of them, Anne Newport Royal, came to petition Congress for her husband's Revolutionary War pension. But she is a fabulous story. Her biography is entitled Grandma of the Muckrakers. And when she showed up in Washington in 1824 to press for her pension, she set her sights on John Quincy Adams. And the story about how she finally got him to meet with her may be apocryphal, but it's too good not to repeat. And that is that she knew that he went swimming in the Potomac every morning, and so she sat on his clothes. And so he had to sort of, and also, get a mental image of that just for a second. John Quincy Adams was one of the greatest prigs of all time. And so, what's he doing? I mean, it's always like, anyway, it's a nice thought. But she then started a newspaper called Paul Pry, which gives you some sense of what it was about. And she exposed the graft, laziness, and ineptitude and nepotism in the government service. And of course, people were horrified. That was not what one did. And she was actually arrested, the first North American ever to be arrested for the crime of being a common scold. Now, honestly, were it still a crime, I would be in deep, deep trouble. But they had eliminated the punishment of ducking, but they still had a fine, and it was $10, and it was paid by a couple of male reporters from the National Intelligencer because they wanted to uphold the honor of the press, which is a kind of humorous thought all by itself. But the reason she was considered so odd was that she was an outsider, just by the fact of being a woman. She was an outsider, and the insiders just found her very, very uncomfortable. With the Civil War, many more women started arriving, mainly to make a living, but also to make a case. And the biggest bomb thrower among them was a woman named Jane Swisshelm, who had left a ne'er-do-well husband and had started newspapers in Pittsburgh and in Minnesota. And she came to Washington, where she started writing for the New York Tribune. And her dispatches were so popular that they were soon on page one, Mrs. Swisshelm's letters. And so she became well-known, and Vice President Millard Fillmore allowed her to be the first woman to report out of the Senate Press Gallery. But she was soon evicted from the Senate Press Gallery for writing vicious truths, and among them that Daniel Webster was a drunk. And she felt that was pertinent. And when I met Jane Swisshelm, who's probably not someone I would have liked, but because she was never funny, but she, felt that this was something that the public had a right to know when he was speaking on such important legislation as the Compromise of 1850. And of course, that's another thing that I just completely recognize, because it really did happen with women of my generation. When we were, Mary Murphy is here, wrote The Girls on the Bus, when we were the girls on the bus. The boys on the bus did not expect us to actually talk about what happened on the bus. And I remember once saying on the Brinkley show that, that David was still there, saying, we actually think that everything that happens on the campaign is important and is newsworthy, and the stuff that isn't newsworthy is certainly, fun to talk about with our friends, like the other reporters' wives. There's dead silence in the studio. The timekeeper for the program timed 45 seconds of silence because they were so terrified at this thought. So it is, we have brought different perspectives. And women have been doing that for a very long time. The women who came during the Civil War, many of them came as advocates for abolition, and some even for suffrage. And of course, you have to remember, this was at a time when there was no such thing as an objective press. The publisher of the New York Times, Henry Raymond, was the chairman of the Republican National Committee. Wouldn't happen at the New York Times today, but for other reasons. But so it was how people did see their view as journalists, was to be advocates. And these women were advocates for women, but they also brought different sensibility, and often they did bring humor. One of them, Mary Jane Wendell, who wrote for the Charleston, South Carolina papers, has just, her writings are just fabulous. And by the way, now, what is so wonderful is that I can read all of these newspapers online. I mean, researching my last book, Capital Names, I'm sitting there, you can waste days doing this. You can read all of them from the late 18th century online. And Mary Jane Wendell talks, she's sitting in the house gallery, and she says, the change produced in the tone of an ordinary man by the letters H-O-N preceding his name is unmistakable. Here he is a public man, and everybody is his most obedient servant. Others, like Mary Clemmer Ames, who became a very famous journalist, she was actually paid $5,000 a year in the 1860s, which is phenomenal, was so upset to see what was happening about women in government service that she became a great promoter of civil service, which didn't exist before that. Women were in government service in large numbers during the Civil War, again, initially arriving because they needed to make a living, but it coincided with the congressional passage of legislation saying that the greenbacks could be printed to pay for the war. And then, as now, money comes off the presses. It's great to go see if you've never seen it. It comes off the presses in these great, huge sheets. And now, of course, machines cut them up. But then it took people sitting with a pair of scissors, cutting out bill by bill by bill. And the treasurer of the United States said, well, women are just better with scissors than men are. And so he hired them in the Treasury in large numbers. He also did allow us how he could pay them less than the men. Journalism also became a refuge of the women whose political husbands, in the end, couldn't support them. And that was true of Jessie Benton Fremont, who, of course, ended up here in Los Angeles. And she wrote for many newspapers and wrote many books. She, at the end of her life, by the way, the women of Los Angeles bought her a house here. And all of the dignitaries of the country, that when they came to LA, that was their first stop, was Jessie's house. She was the most famous woman in America at one point in her life. But she was an example of a Union general's wife who needed the money of journalism to be able to exist. On the Confederate side, there were quite a few. My personal favorite is Verena Davis, who was married to the dreadful Jefferson Davis, but she was great. And bad marriage, but she survived it, and he finally died. And And she got a job with the New York World, and she was eager to move to New York and take the job. Well, it was a scandal beyond belief, you know, the First Lady of the Confederacy moving to New York City, and everybody tried to make her stop it. She had never been fully accepted by the South as a true Southern belle because she wasn't fair-skinned enough, and her grandfather was the governor of New Jersey, and she was suspect and olive-complected. So she wrote to her daughter and said, I am free, brown, and 62. I can move wherever I want to move. And she was a journalist. She was also a great mover towards reconciliation, making a very public friendship with Julia Grant. But the movement of women like that into journalism made it so much more acceptable over the decades. And so by the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, you had a lot of women in journalism, and some of them were incredibly famous, the most famous by far being Nellie Bly, who was a celebrity beyond the likes of any modern-day celebrity, beyond even Donald Trump. And she had become famous by doing a huge expose of Blackwell's Asylum in New York, where she feigned mental illness to get in and report on it. Now, think about it. You know, think of how scary that must have been to do that, but also how willing they were to think she was crazy, because she was a woman. And she then became so famous that the newspaper it was the New York World, decided to capitalize on it. So they staged a contest to have her go around the world in less than 80 days. And everybody followed her in this journey around the world and had to guess how long it was going to take her. This is 1889. And it took her 72 days, 6 hours, 11 minutes, and 14 seconds. And she went by ship, train, horse, and burro. But the special train that met her in San Francisco and brought her back to New York had people lining the tracks all the way across the country because of her incredible fame. World War I, she went off to the Eastern Front, and she stayed after war, where she saw the devastation and used her platform to start appealing for aid to Austrian widows and orphans. She was investigated by the U.S. military intelligence as a possible enemy agent because, as they said, and I am quoting, she is outspoken in her opinions, going to the extent of being aggressive and defiant. And so what she was doing was warning them against the dangers of Bolshevism. But again, who was she? She was an outsider doing this. And so she was therefore dismissed, and she came home, and they made her an advice columnist. And she then used that platform, however, to set up sort of a social service clearinghouse, connecting people who needed things with the people who could help them. About that same time, the very famous and very effective Ida B. Wells was writing. She was born in slavery. She bought into the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight with her school teacher's pay. And when she started writing about how poor the conditions were for black children in the schools, she was fired as a teacher. She then launched a huge anti-lynching campaign, and a white mob destroyed her presses. She went to Europe on a lecture tour, and there she learned of female civic associations. And so she came home and became an agitator for suffrage, but she also, and founded the first black suffrage organization, and she was also one of the founders of the NAACP, a highly significant figure in journalistic history. Then when Eleanor Roosevelt came to the White House, she would only allow women to cover her press conferences, which was a huge move in terms of promoting women in journalism. And with World War II, many more women participated. I'll only name a couple because I've been cutting here. You could have gotten lots more of this history. Anne O'Hare McCormick was the first woman on the New York Times editorial board. She wrote from Europe, but Adolph Ochs refused to hire her, saying, quote, "We have almost a prohibition against women." So her interviews with Hitler, Stalin, Mussolini, FDR were all as a freelancer. Finally, Ochs died. She was hired, and the next year, in 1937, became the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize. A student had won, a female student had won one, but she was the first professional journalist. Helen Kirkpatrick of the Chicago Daily News went to the Daily News to say, you know, I'm going to be in Europe, I want to be reporting. And she was told that they didn't hire women. And she said, "I can't change my sex, but you can change your policy." And she was hired when her first story was the one that all the men said could not be gotten, which was the interview with the Duke of Windsor. She then filed 3 or 4 times a day, column in 24 newspapers. Edward R. Murrow did try to hire her as one of the Murrow boys and was told no women. She was the only woman on the Correspondence Committee for the D-Day landing. You know, one thing people don't realize about D-Day, more than 500, I think 558, something like that, journalists were credentialed to land at D-Day. And everybody kept it a secret. You know, this is something that was always done in previous wars, and particularly in World War II. She crossed France with the French 2nd Armored Division and then was there to set up a bureau to cover Nuremberg. At the time of the war, women were also taking over jobs from men in newsrooms like Rosie the Riveter. They were Rosie the Reporter. And one of them, Dorothy Journey, who had done a wonderful job at the Washington News, was told in 1946 explicitly, as were many of these women implicitly, to train a returning soldier to replace her for her job. She then went to Miami, worked on the women's pages, but then used the women's pages to expose problems with housing in the black community. She went on to Detroit to the women's pages, where she wrote about problems with pension rights, tenure battles, and women's political candidates. So what was beginning to happen was that these women were taking their places on what was supposed to be the frothy part of the newspaper and using them for serious subjects and subjects that the men were not covering. So what happened as a result of that? The newspapers got rid of the women's pages. Simple. They started calling them living, style, something where serious women's issues would not be covered. And in fact, very late in all of this, in my time at ABC, when the New York Times famous editor Abe Rosenthal was challenged over how little women were covered in the newspaper, he said, "We don't cover tea parties." At which point, the women of the New York Times made a little button with a teapot with a slash through it, which sits on, my desk. So at that point, there was a lot of pushback, but it came from a lot of very brave women. Some post-war women did stay on, most notably Pauline Frederick, who had been told, "Stay away from radio, it doesn't like women." Fortunately, she did not take that advice, and she was the first woman on live television covering the 1948 Democratic Convention and the first to moderate a television debate, significant for tonight, and that was in 1976. She was one of the women icons who I looked to my whole life, who jumped over the barriers that were there. I know, Willow, that you've talked about the women that went before you, particularly in sports broadcasting, and how we owe a high debt to the women. But it also required the law changing. And that's what I think you young people really have no understanding of. When I graduated from college in 1964, it was legal to say, as many people did, we don't hire women to do that. Often they did it with their hand on your thigh. And '64 Civil Rights Bill changed that. And that's a whole other story, a long and fascinating story. But the word sex was included in the Title VII, the Anti-Discrimination in Employment Act. So it says, no, you cannot discriminate on the basis of race, religion, national origin, or sex. And in fact, when you listen to the Johnson tapes, which I'm geeky enough to do, you hear Johnson saying to Jack Brooks, who calls him to say that the bill has passed the House, he says, is there anything in it that's going to be a problem in the Senate? And Brooks says, oh, there's something about women, but I think it's okay. And you know, it changed the landscape for employment in America completely. Up until that time, the help wanted ads had been male, female, white, colored. And that completely changed. But it did require brave women to sue under the new law. And they were at the New York Times and Newsweek and CBS, and they did it. But even after that, it was very difficult. Bosses did hire one or two women grudgingly because they wanted to stay out of jail. But the women were still left out of all of, this is now we're into the 1970s, 80s, of all of the male institutions, the National Press Club, the Gridiron Club, all of those. Nan Robertson, a wonderful reporter for the New York Times, wrote the book, The Girls in the Balcony, about the press club. And if you couldn't get to the press club, you couldn't hear foreign leaders coming and talking at the United States in Washington. So they finally said, okay, the women could be in the balcony where they couldn't eat while the men are all downstairs having lunch, and there was no air conditioning, but they could be up there and at least cover the speech. So the change in my lifetime has been enormous. But you know what? It's not enough. And I look at you and see what's going on in journalism schools and see all of these wonderful young women and realize that we really have to do more. The Women's Media Center, looking at data from October 1st to December 31st, 2013, so that's the most recent year we have, found that 64% of the bylines and on-camera appearances at the top 20 networks, newspapers, online institutions were male. And that was when Diane Sawyer was still anchor of ABC News. So now it's even higher male. Women of color have lost ground. Same goes in terms of whose voices we use as experts and who comes on. I must say NPR was not included in this top 20. I think we would have upped the averages a good bit. But still, it's still a shocking number given who comes out of journalism schools. And it matters. It matters because we are cheating you out of jobs, which is big. But even if you're not on a soapbox for suffrage or against lynching, you still bring a different sensibility and a different set of life experience and a different set of priorities to the job. It's not an accident that Megyn Kelly is the person who asked Donald Trump about his statements about women. And it's not an accident that he went after her the way he did, and I think would not probably go after a male in the same way. The whole discussion about male treatment of women is something that we find relevant. I know Matt Bai's book, All the Truth Is Out, about the Gary Hart campaign, has many theories, but he never is unblemished by the fact that Gary Hart was hitting on half the women in the bus. And all the women were trying to find out a way to how could we write about it? When was the right time to write about it? Because we thought it mattered. As one of my colleagues said, he uses women like Kleenex. And that matters. And so I think it's very important to have that viewpoint reflected in the newsroom. And that's what we learned from this history, that women did always bring another perspective while also doing the straight job, whether reporting on widows and orphans in post-war Europe or pension inequality in late 20th century America. I remember when George H.W. Bush was doing budget negotiations out at Andrews Air Force Base, and it was this big omnibus bill, and the negotiators would come out, and my male colleagues would say, is the MX missile still in the bill? And I would say, is coverage for mammograms still in the bill? Now, how many more people do you think are affected by coverage for mammograms than by MX missiles? But so that is just a perspective. It's not doing your job. I still wrote about the MX missiles, but I asked about something that others weren't asking about. And I think that that you have to say, as you go along and get to this point where you are in this wonderful institution, where you have such exposure and you're learning so much and you're going out into a world where the opportunities are vast, that you have to keep pushing, because we need you. We need you to be there in the journalistic world, whichever part of it you choose to be in or chooses you to be in it, because it brings the perspective of the other half of the human race. So thank you, and I'd be delighted to take your questions about that. Questions?
I've got a mic. I can run. Oh, perfect.
Lisa Solomon.
My name is Lisa Solomon, and I wanted to, this dovetails nicely, Cokie, with what you're talking about. I was very blessed in my 20-plus media career to have you as a mentor, and it was, I don't know if you realize this, but just when you go along and you're wondering what you're doing, it was so powerful. Could you give advice to the students on finding mentors and the power of mentorship, especially for women?
Well, I think mentors are terribly important, and I think that's a lot of what this school is all about. And it's one of the reasons that Becky wanted to do this program. I think that if somebody isn't just obvious to be your mentor, which I think I was for you, but go find someone. And I do think that people will respond. I really do. I think that particularly in a school, that people are here to teach and to help. But even in the workplace, I think it's very, very important. And it's important for all kinds of things. I mean, it's not just your professional development, it's personal as well. I mean, I remember at one point when all the young women in the office were having babies, and they were all getting upset, when the baby had a stomach ache. And, when you said for the 15th time, bananas, rice, and cheese, they got it. And, so it can be, it's in some ways, it's the conversation over the back fence that used to be there with your aunts or your great aunts or whatever. And you can have that in the workplace with older people of either sex. Hi.
Hi there. Thank you
You're
so much.
You're brave to stand up as a boy.
Thanks so much for being here today. It means a lot that you're here. My name is Eitan. I'm a broadcast journalism major in Annenberg. My question for you is, first of all, we heard your bio, and your
endlessly.
And your amazing accomplishments in life. My question for you is something I didn't really hear much about is what inspired you to go into journalism?
I don't have a good answer to that because it really is that my husband was doing it and it was easier to switch than fight. But I was always a good writer. I was raised by a very intellectually aggressive order of nuns, and they are still, the few remainings are wonderful, wonderful people, and we wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote, and I recommend that to everybody, no matter what happens to you next. What my own middle-aged children have learned is that because they are such good writers, they can pretty much get any job. And So that was true. I was always a good writer. But when I graduated from college in the dark ages, I didn't really have any expectations of a career. And then the world turned upside down. And I was out here producing a kids show. And then when we went to Greece, I was writing some magazine pieces while I was here. But then when we went to Greece, it was really made all the sense in the world to start reporting, because I could carry that with me. And so that's really what happened. But I was always intellectually curious and always a good writer. And I had loved it, my little stint on the Insider's newsletter, doing that kind of reporting. But my husband was a wonderful mentor to me. And he was always going to be a reporter. If he hadn't always going to be a reporter when we met when we were 18 and 19, I would have gone into politics, but it would have been hard on him. Yes. Yeah.
Did you have a favorite or standout job in your long career? Was there something that this really made an impact on your life for the rest of your life, or you felt you made an impact the most?
Well, no, but the reason, Willow's right, I have been multi-platform for decades, and the reason I do all three is because I like all three, and each one, you can bring a different, you can report differently for each one, and news consumers take each one differently. I'll give you a little example. I was once covering a race in Mississippi. It was a district had just been redistricted to be majority black, but it wasn't majority black enough. And the guy who was the black guy, Democrat running, who was in the state legislature, a white guy switched to the Republicans to run against him. And his slogan was "Elect Webb Franklin, he's one of us." Subtle. And so I went into the shopping mall, and which you were then allowed to do. Now they kick you out. But and interviewed voters about the race, and people were so nervous about it that they physically backed away from the camera as you asked them. Now that worked on television. That didn't work at all anyplace else. And if I tried to describe it someplace else, it sounds gratuitous. So, you use the media, each media, for what it's good for. Print is really good for explaining things, complicated things. Radio is the best. But for you really can hear voices, you can hear passion. You're not distracted by hair and looks and all of that stuff. But they all have their advantages and disadvantages. And when I look back on it, I really do feel it's the body of work that I'm proud of, the many, many years. And I guess in the end, by far the hardest single thing was the books. And this last book, because of all kinds of reasons, I was getting up at 3 a.m. and writing till 6:30 at night, and it was killing me. And it just came out in April, and people keep saying to me, "What's your next book?" And I keep saying, it's like saying, "Mrs. Roberts, you just had triplets. When are you having another baby?" So, yeah.
Ask you a question. You talked a lot about giving us these great examples throughout history of women as outsiders. How did you carve a path for yourself as an insider, as a congressional reporter, and then a career in political news? And what does it take to be an insider, both from a journalistic sensibility, and how do you navigate the waters of conflict?
Well, I actually think that there's a whole other conversation here, because just about the time that women started being accepted as insiders became a naughty word, and whether that's coincidental or not, I don't know. But certainly when I went back to Washington and started, I didn't want to cover Congress because I thought, I lived there. But it became ridiculous for me not to. So there were a couple of things that happened. One is, of course, if you're reporting for a major news organization, members of Congress are consider you a person that they want to talk to. I've always joked that if if NPR sent in somebody with two heads, they wouldn't care a bit. They'd just say, want a cup of coffee or maybe two. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is absolutely, studiously, endlessly doing your homework, so that you were constantly learning, and then being as meticulously fair as you can possibly be. So that, when I was covering the Hill every day, I would walk into the Capitol where there were 535 key residents, 250 at least of whom had heard me that morning. So, you have to, that's happening, and you have to be someone that they want to listen to and want to talk to.
As we're facing this multimedia world as journalists, what kind of skill sets do you feel are critical, and what sort of knowledge do we need to bring to the table as we go out into the world?
Well, I come back to writing. I think the writing skill set is incredibly useful and important. But I also would say, learn about other stuff, not just the craft of journalism. Learn history, learn literature, learn science, learn political science, economics. All of these are very, very useful and important subject matters. You can't learn them all equally, and you'll find that there are ones that you want to specialize in. But, a good, solid liberal arts classical education really stands you in good stead as this world changes every 15 minutes. The reason I'm terrible at this answer is that the women, when you look at the men on the currency, there's no woman who ever had that kind of power. But I now actually feel that I can make a very good case for Clara Barton. Clara Barton, this is one of the things that makes you completely crazy about history books. Many things make you crazy about history books, but Clara Barton, the history books will say, she founded the American Red Cross. Really? Was it hard? Anything go before that? And her whole life story is fascinating, but she, after the Civil War, where she had been so heroic, she went to Europe, discovered the International Red Cross, came back to America, did found the American Red Cross, but then spent 20 years lobbying the United States Senate to ratify the Geneva Conventions, the same ones we're still talking about. That's what the Red Cross was established under, was the Geneva Treaty. And so that the Americans could join the International Red Cross. She then inserted the American Amendment, which says the Red Cross can go to natural disasters as well as war zones. And she then went to Geneva, by now I think it's 1889-ish, and got the American Amendment into the Geneva Treaty. So anytime the Red Cross is in Nepal after an earthquake or in New Orleans after Katrina or whatever, it's because of Clara Barton's lobbying for 2 straight decades. So I can make a case for her. She wasn't a barrel of laughs. Anyway. I can also make a case for Dolly Madison, who held the country together when the men were ready to tear it apart, when it was way too young and way too fragile. And she just made them come to her house and sit down and talk to each other and behave. So that held the country together.
Yes, hi. I'm wondering, with your historical research and with your experience being in politics for so long, is this an era of lack of civility that is different from other areas, and the logjam that we see in terms of legislation and all that, is it different, or is this normal, or what do you see about that?
Yeah, I actually talk about that a lot. They're not shooting each other. That's a big improvement. Metal detectors, and Burr Hamilton was just the most famous of the duels. They shot each other all the time. There was a dueling ground right outside of Washington in Bladensburg, and they'd call each other out on the Senate House floor and go shoot each other over political speech, And Burr was the sitting vice president of the United States and murdered his political enemy over speech. our most recent vice president had a problem with a gun, but as far as I know, it wasn't over there. So, no, it's not the worst time ever. However, it is the worst time since the time right before the Civil War. And that time led to war. So we don't want to replicate it. And I really do think that the only way this is going to get fixed is it has to come from the voters. The voters have got to say at some point, stop it, behave yourselves, do a job. I know, I see your look, and they're saying just the opposite right now, as we'll see tonight. But I don't see anything else fixing it. It's got to be you've got to pay a political price for acting that way. I mean, there's some systemic things I could suggest, but redistricting and all that. But
a few more minutes.
I'm yours.
Sorry. Hi, my name is Sarah. Nice to meet you.
Nice to see you.
You said that we could ask about politics, so
Sure.
I'm going to ask about politics. The more prominent candidates right now that people are talking about are the more dark horse candidates. Do you think that, or can you just comment on that? And also, do you think that that is partially a product of the journalism era today?
Well, you're talking about Donald Trump, Ben Carson,
And Bernie Sanders.
Okay.
They're not the people, I guess, the experts would think that Jeb Bush and Hillary Clinton would
right.
be
Okay.
leaders
All
right
right.
now.
I think actually the two parties are different in this respect right now. I do think that in terms of Trump and Carson and Fiorina being the three of them together do make up in most of the polls a majority of Republican primary voters. And I think they do represent a real anger and upset in the Republican primary electorate, and people saying, I hate the way things are working. Government doesn't work. The country's going down the wrong path. All of that. I think on the Democratic side, I think that Sanders is appealing to a portion of the Democratic electorate, and I do think it's pro-Sanders rather than anti-Hillary for the most part. That has always been there. About 25% of the Democratic electorate is very liberal, and that's what he's getting, is about 25% of the Democratic electorate. So I think that they are different. Now, in terms of the journalistic part of it, the Trump phenom is clearly something that we who've covered elections forever and ever, amen, did not anticipate and kept thinking would go away. But and that has a lot to do with new media, with his celebrity status, with all of that. Newt Gingrich said to me the other day, he said, Donald Trump is running the first reality TV presidential campaign. And none of us, have even seen reality TV. I've seen HGTV. That's about as close as I've come. So I think that, a lot of us who have been doing this forever have a lot of learning to do. One of the reasons it'd be fun to watch tonight with all of you guys.
Thanks, Willow. Hi. I'm Casey Cole. Thank you very much for that. So I have a practical question of advice for the young women, because this kind of implicit or overt bias, whether it's putting his hand on your knee or whatever, it still goes on. It goes on for veterans.
But they can go to jail.
Right, but for young, vulnerable women, and I hear this a lot from women students, is what is a polite way? I mean, they're just starting out, and these guys are going to determine their careers to a point, and obviously they're scared and they're worried, and it still does happen a lot. So I wonder if there's a nice, funny, non-threatening, I don't even know, but some way that they can make it clear that this is not okay and they're a serious person without
offending the person.
Exactly.
I don't have a cute comeback, but that is often the right answer, is a cute comeback. I mean, I actually have been saying that today about the candidates on the stage tonight. They should have cute comebacks, because anything else they try is going to be not go anywhere. But if it's serious, if a boss of either sex is doing something that is harassment, there should be things in place in the news, in the institution, to be able to have somebody you can go to and talk to about it. And that is, again, a place where an older mentor can make a tremendous difference, of going and saying, you know, I just don't know how to handle this. Can you help me? And sometimes in that case, I could go to the guy and say, you know, it's not funny. You know, back off. And I mean, you have to judge it, but it, and you have to sort of dole out your common scolding, but it is a place where older people in the workplace can be helpful. Okay. Oh, thank you so much. What a treat to be with all of you. Thank you.